Unseen Poetry Analysis, Mid-Term Break by Seamus Heaney. So the first thing I notice is that the title of this poem, Mid-Term Break, would suggest something fun, something joyful, perhaps a time for relaxing. And that is setting my expectations for this poem. If I know Seamus Heaney, I know that he is a modern poet. I know that he is from Northern Ireland, so I might have some idea of his context. But other than that, this is where I'm at the start of the poem. So just reading through, first of all, I'd probably have a full read through of the poem. And as I'm reading, I'd be thinking about the structure. How is the poem set out in terms of stanzas? And trying in my first reading to get the general message. So, I sat all morning in the college sick bay, counting bells knelling classes to a close. At 2 o'clock, our neighbours drove me home. In the porch, I met my father crying. He had always taken funerals in his stride, and big Jim Evans saying it was a hard blow. The baby cooed and laughed and rocked the pram when I came in, and I was embarrassed by old men standing up to shake my hand and tell me they were sorry for my trouble. Whispers informed strangers I was the eldest, away at school, and as my mother held my hand in hers and coughed out angry tearless sighs, at 10 o'clock the ambulance arrived, with the corpse, stanched and bandaged by the nurses. Next morning I went up into the room. Snowdrops and candles soothed the bedside. I saw him for the first time in 6 weeks. Paler now, wearing a poppy bruise on his left temple. He lay in the 4-foot box as in his cot. No gaudy scars, the bumper knocked him clear. A 4-foot box, a foot for every year. So after my first reading, I'm seeing that it's actually not about a relaxing break at all. It is about the death of his brother. Obviously quite a somber subject matter. And as I read through, I noticed that these stanzas are all quite regular, 3-line stanzas, apart from the last, which has a 1-line sitting on its own at the bottom, which forms part of a rhyming couplet with the line before. In terms of a rhyme scheme, nothing struck me immediately as rhyming, although looking through it now I can see a little bit of assonance going on in those final words of each line, but we'll perhaps focus on that later on. So let's see what we can spot. I sat all morning in the college sick bay. This is telling me that he was a student and he was at school. And it's telling me that his normal life, his normality has been interrupted, which is often the case with a sudden death. This would link back to the idea in the title that a midterm break, the expectations are there for this to be a fun time, and actually for this family, things have changed forever, and that break will never be the same again. Here he is, he's counting bells, knelling classes to a close. So we've got a lot of alliteration of this hard k sound. Alliteration is always a funny one. Why is it there? Well, because it just is. But personally, I think it shows how he is perhaps a little bit frustrated at sitting waiting. He knows something has happened, but he's a little bit powerless to do anything. So there's that idea of quite a hard, unsympathetic sound, perhaps showing that he is frustrated. You will find when you're analysing poetry that really there isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer. You are giving theoretical possibilities, and so long as you back those up with evidence and it sounds plausible, then you're on the right lines. At 2 o'clock, our neighbours drove me home. So this is part of the narrative, and this is a narrative poem. It's giving us the story of what's happened to him. In the porch, I met my father crying. He had always taken funerals in his stride, and big Jim Evans saying it was a hard blow. So at this point, we're seeing a little bit of a comment on masculinity. I'm not sure if this is a fair assumption, but I would say that in Ireland in the 50s or 60s when this was written, that men crying was an unusual sight. And so that demonstrates the depth of this father's loss. The punctuation here is interesting because the punctuation shows, again, a break from normality. And quite often, if we have dashes, it does that. It's an aside. It's saying something is different here. Pay attention to this. And the father had always taken funerals in his stride before this time. So um, he's not a stranger to death, but this is particularly poignant death, being the death of such a young boy and his son. So we move straight from the male perspective, the adult male perspective, onto the baby. And the baby is not affected at all by the death of its elder sibling. It cooed and laughed and rocked the pram when the narrator came in. This shows that really the baby has no idea of what's going on, and this is part of the narrative to say that really life has to go on, even in the times of death. Um, and he was embarrassed by old men standing up to shake my hand and tell me they were sorry for my trouble. This is very much the public face of grief, and it's not time yet for this character, this narrator, to deal with his grief in private. This is the social code of what is expected at funerals, people giving their condolences and you giving some sort of response. The idea that this, again, the punctuation here, that the quotation is in um, speech marks, gives the idea that this is a stock phrase. This is what everybody says. It's not really meaningful. It's just a way of expressing condolence, and it's the sort of thing that you would hear regularly at funerals. Whispers informed strangers I was the eldest, away at school, as my mother held my hand in hers and coughed out angry, tearless sighs. So again, the idea of whispers is about social niceties, really, of how you are meant to behave at a funeral. And the personification of the whispers gives it an impersonal air. It's not any one particular person. Generally, those whispers are moving around the room, telling everybody who is who and what their role is within the funeral. And then we're also hearing a little bit more of the narrative. This character is the eldest, and with that goes certain responsibilities, including comforting his mother. We move on in the next stanza to the female response. So it's rather a different kind of response than the father's. So the father is crying, but the mother holds her eldest child's hand and coughed out angry, tearless sighs. So this metaphor um, gives quite a different perspective on grief. It's an angry perspective. The fact that her sighs are tearless means that she's not at the stage of grieving yet where she's crying. And actually the overriding emotion for her is anger. This we could comment further on this, but I'm going to keep moving on because this is the bit for me where it gets quite interesting. At 10 o'clock the ambulance arrived with the corpse stanched and bandaged by the nurses. So this is our first mention of the child that's died, and he is called the corpse. So this is not a personal name. It's not giving the child an identity, and there's a very real reason for that. I think at this point the narrator still hasn't even started to deal with the grief that's happening, and so at this point at the funeral it is easier to talk about the deceased in impersonal terms. This continues. We don't hear his name, and again, I feel that that's telling us that as yet, this character, this narrator, hasn't started to unpick the feelings that he has around his little brother dying. Next morning. So here is where we see a shift. So structurally, this is a definite shift in focus, and we begin to see the personal side of the grief. This is when the first opportunity rather, that this character has had to be alone with his little brother since he died. Snowdrops and candles soothed the bedside. So the personification here of the snowdrops and the candles really connote innocence, and the fact that snowdrops, the first flower of spring, represent this early time in our lives. This little boy was taken at a very young age, and I think the snowdrops are meant to represent him. For me, the candles are possibly to do with religion and to do with the fact that at times of grief and of need, then the church is something, particularly in Ireland's context, that is going to be used by people as a support. I saw him for the first time in 6 weeks. So again, no name, but we're getting closer. He is a him now instead of being a corpse. And then we go on to a description. He's paler now, wearing a poppy bruise on his left temple. There are connotations in the word poppy of sacrifice and loss, and remembrance. He lay in the 4-foot box as in his cot. This simile here really reminds us how small he is, and how young he is. And it's really bringing the tragedy home for us. The last 2 lines for me are the most poignant in the whole poem. No gaudy scars. So we see that this child in death is perfect still. His beauty isn't changed. The bumper knocked him clear. A 4-foot box, a foot for every year. And we finally understand that actually this child was only 4 years old. And we see the full tragedy. And by Seamus Heaney saving this till the last line, this reveal at the end really heightens the poignancy of the poem. Suddenly we know that this is a very small child that died, and the rest of the poem starts to have increasing significance as we look back over it. So that would be the first run through. If I was in an exam situation, this would be what I would do quickly to start my analysis. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.